The wind moved across Montana territory the way grief moves through a man who has stopped fighting it. Not violent, not sudden, just present, constant, working its way into every crack and hollow, carrying the scent of early snow and dying grass sweeping through the scattered pines that clung to the mountainside like old soldiers who had forgotten why they were still standing. The sky hung low and gray, swollen with the promise of winter's first true storm. In another month, these trails would be impassable. In another month, men with homes would retreat to their hearths, to their wives, to the warmth of a life that had been deliberately constructed against the cold. Caleb Harrow had none of those things. He had not had them for 3 years. He guided his horse, a dappled gray mare named Ash, through the outskirts of Millstone Creek as the sun began its slow surrender toward the jagged horizon. The town was small, perhaps 200 souls at most, clustered around a single dirt road that served as both thoroughfare and gathering place. Wooden buildings leaned against each other with the tired intimacy of people who had run out of things to say but could not bear to be alone. Paint peeled from every surface. Windows caught the amber light of approaching dusk and threw it back, distorted like memories that no longer matched the truth of what had actually happened. Caleb did not slow his pace. He had learned over the past 3 years that stopping meant questions. Questions meant connections. Connections meant the specific kind of pain that came from letting someone see how thoroughly a man could be hollowed out by a single night in April. He was 43 years old, though his face had long since stopped keeping honest count. His hair, dark brown, shot through with premature silver, fell to his collar beneath a weathered hat that had seen better decades and did not seem to mind. A scar traced the full length of his left cheek, a gift from a knife fight in a place whose name he could no longer recall, in a year that felt like it belonged to a different man entirely. His eyes were gray-blue, the color of ice on a river that has not quite decided to thaw, and they moved constantly, taking in every doorway and shadow, and shifting shape with the automatic vigilance of someone who had spent years learning that stillness was a luxury only the innocent could afford. The holster at his hip carried a Colt revolver, standard issue, or it had been once. If you looked closely, if the light caught the barrel at precisely the right angle, you could see where the factory engraving had been attacked, with something sharp and deliberate, the metal bearing deep gouges, as though someone had tried to erase the words that had once been pressed into it. The words that told the world what the man who carried it was supposed to be. In his coat pocket, wrapped in a scrap of worn leather, rested the other remnant of a former life. A United States Marshal's badge broken cleanly in half. He kept both pieces. He had asked himself why on more cold nights than he could count, and the honest answer was always the same. He was not yet sure whether he was keeping them as a reminder of what he had lost or as a door he had not fully decided to close. The difference mattered. He had not yet determined how much. Ash picked her way through the edge of town with the practiced indifference of an animal that had learned to distrust permanent things. A woman sweeping her porch glanced up and looked away. A man loading supplies onto a wagon let his gaze linger a half-second longer than courtesy required, then found something more important to study in the middle distance. Nobody spoke. Nobody waved. Caleb passed the general store, the saloon with its hand-painted sign faded to near illegibility, the modest church with its crooked steeple pointing at the sky like a man making an uncertain argument to God. He had ridden for 6 days straight, moving northwest from a forgettable settlement near the Yellowstone River. Before that, another town. Before that, another. Always moving, always asking the same question in the same flat tone that discouraged follow-up. Have you heard of a man named Douglas Hale? The answers were always variations of the same thing. Head shakes, confused expressions, occasional flickers of something behind the eyes, some recognition or fear that vanished before it could be named. Once in a trading post along the Missouri, a fur trapper had gone very still at the question and then said carefully that he thought he might have heard the name but could not be sure. His hands had trembled slightly when he reached for his drink. Caleb had not pushed. He had learned when pushing closed doors rather than opening them. The edge of town approached. Beyond it, the trail dissolved into the wide emptiness of the Montana plains, rolling toward mountains that caught the last light of the day and held it like something precious they intended to keep. Caleb prepared to nudge Ash into a trot to leave Millstone Creek behind the way he had left every other town, as a space passed through rather than a place known. Then something made him stop. Not a sound, not a movement, just some instinct carried in the blood, the awareness that develops in men who have spent years reading the unspoken language of the land. He turned ash toward the river, a dark ribbon of water, 200 yards to his left, bordered by bare cottonwood trees and smooth gray stone. He dismounted at the water's edge. His boots struck the frozen ground with a sound like glass under pressure. The river moved slowly here, thick with cold, its surface reflecting the darkening sky in long, wavering strips of gray and amber. He stood at the very margin where water met stone and looked down. His reflection stared back at him, distorted by the current, into something that shifted and reformed and could not quite settle. A man hollowed out by grief, a lawman without a star, a husband who had come home to an empty house and a body at the undertaker's, and a case file that read like an insult to everything he knew about justice. The water rippled, and for a moment, just a single heartbeat between one breath and the next, the reflection changed. Instead of the weathered, road-worn face looking back at him, he saw another. A woman. Hair the color of late afternoon sunlight falling soft around a face that had never quite learned how to conceal what it was feeling. Green eyes full of a kind of laughter that came not from amusement, but from genuine delight in the fact of being alive. A smile that had once been his entire definition of home. Grace. Caleb closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was only the river, only the cold, only the present moment with its inventory of losses. His hand moved automatically to his chest, to the place where he kept her wedding ring, on a cord of leather beneath his shirt pressed against his sternum. He did not pull it out. He had not looked at it in months. Looking at it made the wound fresh in a way that felt almost like a choice, and there were enough wounds that chose themselves without his cooperation. 3 years. 3 years since someone had taken her from him in a back street in Redemption Creek on a night in April, when the world had not given any warning that it was about to become unrecognizable. 3 years since he had come home from 3 days on the road to Helena and found the case already closed, the file already signed, the official story already locked into place like a door sealed from the inside. Robbery gone wrong, random violence, no suspects. The signature on the closing report had belonged to Sheriff Cole Deaton, the man who had at that point been Caleb's colleague and professional acquaintance for 4 years. The man who had stood at the graveside service with an expression of appropriate sorrow and shaken Caleb's hand and said all the proper words. 3 years of writing had clarified what Deaton had been: not a lawman, but a tool, a hired mechanism belonging to a larger machine. The machine had a name. Finding the name had taken months of careful, painful questioning. Confirming it had taken a year after that. Douglas Hale. That was the name at the center of it. Caleb had asked after it in every settlement between Redemption Creek and the Canadian border. Always in that careful, flat tone, always watching the listener's face for the thing behind the eyes. He had built a picture of Hale from fragments, each one small and insufficient on its own, each one slightly different from the last. A man of power, a man with reach, a man who had constructed himself into something that seemed from the outside to be indistinguishable from legitimate authority. But a machine built on murder had specific vulnerabilities. It was only a matter of finding the right place to apply pressure. Caleb turned from the river, reached for Ash's reins, and prepared to ride on. He did not ride on. The sound that stopped him was light and uneven, the rhythm of feet moving fast over ground that could not quite be trusted. He turned without thinking, his hand dropping toward the Colt with the reflexive economy of movement that 30 years of hard experience had burned permanently into his nervous system. He did not draw. He turned his body to present a smaller target and waited, watching the growing shadows between the rocks near the road. She came out of the darkness between two granite outcroppings, and the sight of her produced in Caleb something that he had not felt in a very long time, something that was almost shock. The child could not have been more than 9 years old, small even for that age, with matted blonde hair hanging past her shoulders in tangles that spoke of days without a comb or a steady hand to manage it. Her dress had once been blue, a pale and hopeful color, but it had been torn in several places and stained with grime and what looked in the fading light like old blood that had dried to a dark rust. Her feet were bare despite the freezing ground, and the soles, even from 10 feet away, showed the evidence of wounds that had opened and scabbed and opened again over what must have been weeks of hard use. But it was her eyes that made Caleb's breath go still in his chest. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things that could not be unseen and had made a decision somewhere deep in private not to let the seeing break what remained. Not old exactly. Children's eyes were never old. but knowing in a way that was wrong for the age behind them, waited with an awareness that should have had decades more time to accumulate before it arrived. She ran toward him with the desperate, committed speed of someone who had been running for a long time towards something and had finally located it. When she was perhaps 10 feet away, her left foot found a patch of uneven, frozen ground, and she stumbled, going down hard. Caleb moved before the thought had formed, completely crossing the distance in 2 strides and catching her before the fall was finished. Her weight was startlingly small. Her skin was ice cold in a way that went beyond the temperature of the evening. She looked up at him. For one brief moment, something moved across her face that was almost recognition. Then it was replaced by something harder and more purposeful. They're coming to kill him tonight. The words were barely a whisper. He could feel her trembling through the fabric of his coat, though whether from cold or fear or exhaustion, or all three, simultaneously he could not tell. He held her carefully and said nothing for a moment, letting the statement settle into the air between them before he tried to respond to it. "Who's coming?" he said, "and who are they going to kill?" Before he could ask anything further, she looked up at him with those impossible eyes and said something that stopped his internal calculations entirely. "You're the only person here who looks like they've already been through hell and managed to keep walking." Caleb Harrow had not been caught off guard by words in a very long time. This child caught him off guard. He studied her more carefully. The matted hair, the ruined feet, the old blood on her dress, which he was now fairly certain was not her own. The way she looked at him without flinching, without the reflexive wariness that children generally showed around large armed men they did not know. This was not the behavior of a child who had been sheltered from hard things. This was the behavior of someone who had been educated by them. "What's your name?" he said. "Eliza." "Eliza what?" A pause, brief but present. "Just Eliza." He accepted this without pressing it. "All right, Eliza, who's coming and who are they going to kill?" "My father," she said. And then with a precision that suggested she had been rehearsing the argument in her mind for some time. "I tried everyone in town. All of them said no. Some of them said he deserves it. He doesn't deserve it. He saved my life, and they want to hang him for it. You're the only person I haven't tried." Caleb felt the familiar weight settle across his shoulders, the gravity of someone else's need pressing down on a man who had spent 3 years learning to be unreachable. He had become quite good at being unreachable. It was one of the few competencies he had developed in the years since Redemption Creek that he was not ashamed of. "I can't help you," he said. His voice was not unkind. It was simply honest in the way that a stone wall is honest. "I'm sorry." He gently removed her small fingers from his coat, turned to Ash, set his foot in the stirrup and mounted. He kept his eyes forward on the dark trail ahead. Behind him, the child said nothing. No crying, no pleading, no further argument. Just silence. It was the silence that did it. Not the words, not the desperate eyes, not the ruined feet or the bloodstained dress. The silence was what turned Ash around, because it was the silence of someone who had used up all their hope and had found on the other side of it a kind of terrible peace. Caleb knew that silence intimately. He had lived inside it for the better part of 3 years. It was the sound a person made when they had nothing left to lose, because losing required having, and hoping was a form of having, that left you vulnerable in ways that simple emptiness did not. He pulled the reins. Ash stopped. He sat very still for a long moment, looking at the dark trail ahead. Then the girl's voice reached him, small but perfectly clear in the gathering dark. "Then I'll go back alone and watch him die, like I watched my mother die." The words hit him in a place that had nothing to do with reason. He knew that quality of resignation. He recognized it the way a man recognizes the face of someone he has seen in a mirror for too long. It was not despair exactly. Despair implied that things could be otherwise, and the awareness of that difference was what caused the pain. This was something past despair, something emptier and in certain ways more terrible. It was the voice of someone who had made their peace with the worst outcome, because the worst outcome was the only one that seemed reliable. Caleb turned Ash around. The girl was still standing where he had left her, small and motionless, against the vast, darkening backdrop of mountains and sky. She was not watching him. She was looking north toward whatever was waiting for her in the trees. There was no plea in her posture, no performance. She had already moved internally to whatever came next. He dismounted, walked to where she stood, and crouched down so that his face was level with hers. "How far?" he said. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, something careful and controlled, as though Hope itself had become a thing to be managed rather than felt. 8 miles, maybe a little more, through the forest. You walk that alone, every day for 2 years. He looked at the sky. Full dark in less than an hour. The temperature would drop another 10 degrees before morning. Wolves hunted in these woods. Other things hunted in these woods too. Things that walked on two legs and had reasons that would not survive examination in daylight. I'll take you there, he said. That's all. I take you there, I make sure you're safe, and then I leave. Do you understand? Yes. All right, he stood. Can you walk 8 miles on those feet? She looked down at them for a moment, then back up at him. I've been walking on them for 2 weeks. That's not what I asked. The smallest possible thing happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Something in the neighborhood of one. Yes, I can walk. Then let's move. We're losing light. He took Ash's reins and began walking north toward the tree line where the pines grew thick and dark. Eliza fell in beside him without being told, her bare feet making almost no sound on the frozen earth. Her stride steady and deliberate in a way that spoke of long practice, navigating difficult ground in difficult conditions. She did not speak. She did not ask questions. She simply walked, her gaze fixed forward, with a composure that in someone her age was either a remarkable natural gift or the product of a very hard education. Caleb suspected the latter. They entered the forest as the last light left the sky entirely. The pines closed around them like walls, their upper branches forming a canopy that swallowed even the pale remnants of dusk. Caleb let his eyes adjust, trusting Ash to feel the path beneath her hooves. The mare had traveled worse terrain in darker conditions and had never yet failed to find the way through. What surprised him was that Eliza moved ahead naturally, not aggressively, or with any desire to assert herself, but with the quiet authority of someone who simply knew exactly where she was going. She navigated around fallen timber with the ease of long familiarity, chose paths that appeared random to Caleb, but always proved 100 yards on to have been the right choice. She read the forest the way experienced men read people, by attending to small details most observers never thought to notice. After what might have been an hour of walking, Caleb broke the silence. How long have you been taking care of him alone? 4 days since he was shot, she said. Her voice was matter of fact, the tone of a person reporting facts rather than confessing difficulties. But I've been with him alone for 2 years. What about your mother? The pace of her feet did not change, but something shifted in the set of her shoulders. A very small, very controlled contraction. She's with the angels now. That's what the preacher said. I'm sorry. Don't be. You didn't kill her. The words came out without inflection, not as an accusation and not as an absolution, simply as a statement of logical fact. They hung in the cold air for a long moment before dissolving into the darkness between the trees. Caleb said nothing more. There were certain things that silence honored better than speech. Another mile passed beneath their feet before he spoke again. He had been watching her gait, and the slight asymmetry of it had not resolved as he had hoped it might with the rhythm of steady movement. Stop for a moment. We don't have time to... Eliza, stop. She stopped. He crouched and gestured toward her left foot. She lifted it with the reluctance of someone who knows what is about to be discovered and would prefer that it remain undiscovered. Even in the fragmentary moonlight filtering through the pine canopy above, the damage was clear. Deep cuts across the heel and the ball of the foot, several of them reopened recently, the surrounding tissue showing the dull swelling of infection that had been walked on rather than treated. She had been moving on this for 2 weeks, at minimum. This is going to hurt, he said. Everything hurts, she said, not as a complaint, as information. He pulled a clean cloth and a small flask of whiskey from the saddlebag. He worked as quickly and as carefully as the limited light allowed, cleaning the wounds, with the methodical focus of someone who had done this kind of field medicine, often enough that it no longer required the full allocation of his attention. Eliza did not make a sound throughout the process. She stared at the trees above her, her jaw set, her hands balled into fists at her sides, and endured it with a self-discipline that he found in an uncomfortable way deeply familiar. He wrapped the foot in strips torn from the cloth. Not ideal, better than what she had. You should have told someone in town, he said, about your feet, about all of it. I did tell someone, she said, the doctor's wife. She said I deserved it for being his daughter. Caleb looked at her sharply. What did your father do that made people say that? She met his eyes without hesitation. He saved my life, and they want to hang him for it. She turned and started walking again before he could ask what she meant by that. He followed the question multiplying in his mind as they moved deeper into the forest. Some stories he had learned could not be hurried. They came out in their own time on their own terms, or they did not come out at all. He had learned to wait, and waiting was something he had become very good at in the years since Redemption Creek. Waiting was one of those skills that grief taught without asking permission. They walked for another hour. The forest thinned gradually, the tight columns of pine giving way to a more open terrain of mixed timber and rocky outcroppings, the ground rising slightly, then falling again. Eliza navigated it all with the same unhurried certainty. Then she stopped, so suddenly that he nearly walked into her. She was staring at something ahead of them in the darkness, a clearing barely visible through the last rank of trees, and in the center of it, standing alone like a monument that had outlasted whatever it was meant to commemorate, a massive oak tree. Its branches were bare, reaching into the night sky in every direction, skeletal and dark against the slightly lighter darkness above. Eliza walked toward it slowly with a kind of deliberate reverence that made Caleb hang back without being told to. She placed her small hand flat against the bark and stood there for a long moment, with her lips moving in what might have been a prayer, or might have been something more private than prayer. He waited. In watching, he noticed what she was touching. Words carved into the bark, deep and deliberate, permanent. 2 words in a year. For Clara. 1884. Caleb went very still. 1884 was the year Grace had died. Clara was a common enough name. The year was just a year. He told himself both of these things clearly and firmly, the way a man speaks to himself when he suspects he is about to be made a fool by his own longing. But when Eliza finally turned away from the tree, there were tears on her face. The first tears he had seen from her. She wiped them away with her sleeve with the brisk efficiency of someone who regards the act of being seen crying as a practical problem to be solved rather than an emotional state to be inhabited. "Who was Clara?" he said. "My mother." She did not look at him. "I come here sometimes to talk to her, to tell her I'm sorry I couldn't save her. You were a child. You couldn't have saved her. She was sick," they said, in her mind. But she wasn't. Something fierce entered Eliza's voice, for the first time a heat that had been absent from everything she had said before. She saw something bad happen, and they killed her for it. The same people who are coming tonight. He looked at her. The same people who run this territory. Yes. She turned from the tree and began walking again, faster now. Another mile, maybe less. He followed his mind, already moving in new patterns, assembling the pieces of the picture she had been painting in careful fragments over the past 2 hours. A conspiracy, a murder disguised as something else. A woman who had seen what she should not have seen and paid for it. A man protecting a child in the aftermath, hunted for the act of having protected her. And a girl carrying the weight of all of it on bare feet through a frozen forest because there was no one else left to carry it. He thought of Grace, of a promise that had not been kept, and the damage that unkept promises did to a man over time. He had been writing for 3 years toward a name. He had not expected to arrive at the name through the medium of a 9-year-old girl with wounded feet and her dead mother's eyes. But the world had never particularly concerned itself with the shape of his expectations. The cabin appeared through the last trees like something that had been designed with a specific kind of violence in mind. Small, perhaps 20 feet square, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to the color of a storm sky. But the windows had been boarded over with heavy planking, narrow horizontal slits cut at eye level with the deliberate geometry of function rather than carpentry. Firing ports. The door had been reinforced with iron straps bolted through the frame. The area surrounding the structure had been cleared of every piece of undergrowth and loose timber for a full 30 feet in every direction, creating an open killing ground with nowhere for an approaching threat to find concealment. This was not a home, this was a redoubt, the kind of structure a man built when he had accepted that he was going to be found eventually and had decided to make the finding expensive. Eliza stopped at the edge of the clearing. For the first time since they had met, she looked her age. She looked like a frightened child standing at the edge of something she desperately wanted to be past. "He's inside," she said quietly. "He doesn't know I left. He'll be angry." "Does he hurt you when he's angry?" The answer came immediately, and it was completely different from everything else she had said. Not flat, not controlled, not the rehearsed tonelessness she used for things she had already made peace with. Just direct and certain and fierce. "Never. He would die before he hurt me. That's why they hate him." Before Caleb could ask what she meant, the cabin door swung open. The man in the doorway was holding a Winchester rifle with the easy automatic competence of someone who had spent significant time becoming familiar with the instrument. He was perhaps 38 years old, though hardship had been doing the same arithmetic to his face that it had done to Caleb's, adding years that the calendar had not yet earned. Tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had spent their working lives moving heavy things. His hands, visible on the rifle's forend and grip, were thick with the kind of scarring that accumulates from years of heat and iron. A blacksmith, Caleb thought, or had been, once. His shirt was soaked with blood, old and fresh, both a bandage wrapped around his left shoulder that had saturated completely, another visible at his right side just above the hip. The rifle barrel held steady despite the wounds, despite the slight swaying that Caleb could see even from 40 feet, the involuntary movement of a man fighting to maintain what his body was increasingly reluctant to provide. Eliza. The man's voice was low and rough with pain, and something that might have been relief and might have been fury, and was almost certainly both simultaneously. Get behind me, now. Papa, no. He followed me here. He helped me. He bandaged my feet. Please. Move now. He's not one of them. I know he's not. Please trust me. The rifle did not lower. The man's eyes moved from Eliza to Caleb with a steady professional assessment that Caleb recognized as the same skill he himself had been applying to other people his entire adult life. The reading of another person as a problem to be evaluated rather than a human being to be encountered. It was the look of someone who had learned that the two things were sometimes indistinguishable. Caleb raised both hands, palms forward. I'm not here to hurt anyone. The girl asked for help getting home. I brought her. That's the full extent of my involvement, and if you want me gone, I'll be gone. The rifle barrel held for another long moment. Then it lowered. Not enthusiastically, not with trust, but with the pragmatic acknowledgement of a man who had evaluated the odds and found them acceptable. You, he gestured with the rifle barrel toward the door. Inside, hands where I can see them. Caleb moved forward across the cleared ground. As he approached, he got his first clear look at the man in the lamplight spilling through the doorway. The face was strong-boned and hard, the face of a man who had never been given much in the way of softness by the world and had stopped expecting it. But the eyes, even across the pain and fever that filmed them, held something that Caleb had not expected to find. Not cruelty, not calculation, not the cold intelligence of men who hurt others for profit or pleasure. Something closer to grief, something close to exhausted love. The wounds told the rest of the story that the face began. 2 gunshot wounds, both of them recent. The shoulder wound still seeping through its ruined bandage. The side wound a through and through from the look of it, showing the characteristic discoloration of beginning infection around the entry point. Without proper treatment, sepsis would kill him in 4 days. Possibly 3. Come to finish the job, the man said. The words were bitter, but the bitterness had the quality of old habit rather than fresh feeling, the automatic response of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the worst available interpretation. If I came to finish the job, Caleb said, you would already be finished. Silence. The man looked at him for a long moment with the attention of someone who has become very skilled at detecting deception and is currently finding the exercise frustrating. Then what do you want? Caleb looked at Eliza, who had moved to the man's side and was standing with one hand pressed against his arm in a gesture that was part comfort and part steadying, the instinctive physical support of someone who had been performing this function for a long time. Then he looked back at the man. Let me help with those wounds, he said, then I'll go. Why? You don't know us. You don't owe us anything. Because someone should. The words came out before he had quite decided to say them, and once said they hung in the air with the weight of statements that are true in a way that goes beyond their immediate context. Because someone should and no one has, and here I am. That's all there is to it. The man studied him for another long moment, searching for the angle, for the hidden transaction, for the thing that was being offered in exchange for the thing being asked. Not finding it, he stepped back from the doorway. You try anything, he said, and I'll put a bullet in you with my last breath. Fair enough, Caleb said and walked inside. The interior was spare in the way of a place that had been arranged entirely around survival rather than living. A single room with a narrow bed against the far wall, a small iron stove in one corner, radiating inadequate heat, a table and 2 chairs, a wash basin. But every wall held evidence of the same careful preparation visible outside. Ammunition stacked near the firing ports. Water barrels placed for access without exposure. Canned food enough for weeks. A rifle and a shotgun propped within arm's reach of the bed. A handgun on the table beside the lamp. This was the home of a man who had accepted that one day he would be found, and had spent 2 years making himself as difficult to kill as his resources allowed. The man made it to the bed before his legs made the decision for him, dropping onto the thin mattress with the controlled collapse of someone who had been running on will for too long and had just run out. His face was the color of old ash. His breathing was shallow and too fast. Caleb was already moving. "Eliza," he said, "I need water. Hot if you can manage it, and whatever alcohol you have in the cabin." She was moving before he finished the sentence. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed and began carefully peeling back the blood-soaked bandages. The man watched him with fever-filmed eyes that still held even now a residue of assessment and resistance. "This is going to hurt considerably," Caleb said. "Do what you need to do. What's your name?" A pause that lasted precisely as long as the man needed to decide that the information was not dangerous. Nathan Croft. Caleb Harrow." He examined the shoulder wound, probing gently. The bullet was still there, lodged deep in the deltoid muscle. "I'm going to need to take that bullet out." "I know. It's going to be worse than the cleaning." "I know that too." "All right then." He worked through this night. Nathan Croft bore the extraction with a leather strap between his teeth and sounds that never quite became screaming, controlled through the same iron discipline that had kept him standing in the doorway with a rifle despite wounds that should have had him unconscious days ago. The cleaning of the side wound was the worst ordeal of the two, the whiskey doing its necessary work in a process that finally broke through Nathan's control and produced one raw, ragged cry that echoed off the cabin walls and brought Eliza from across the room to her father's side without being called. She held his hand. She murmured things that Caleb could not hear and did not try to hear. She brought fresh water and clean cloth and moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, who had been the single capable person in a frightened room and had learned exactly what was needed and when. 9 years old, and she moved like a surgeon's assistant. Dawn was breaking when Caleb finally sat back. Nathan was unconscious but breathing with a steadiness that had not been present 6 hours earlier. The fever remained, but it had not worsened. With rest, with luck, with the stubbornness that the living sometimes brought to the matter of continuing to live, he might survive this. Caleb washed his hands in the basin. His arms ached from the sustained, delicate work of the night. He had not slept. He had not eaten. Neither condition bothered him as much as it should have, which told him something about the state he had been operating in for the past 3 years. Eliza appeared at his elbow with a tin cup of water. "Thank you," she said. He took the cup and drank. The water was cold and very clean. "He'll need watching," Caleb said. "The fever could still take him." "I know, I've done it before." A pause. "Will you stay just until he's better?" Caleb looked at the man on the bed, at the child beside him, at the fortified walls around them both. He thought about the trail he had been riding for 3 years. He thought about Douglas Hale. He thought about Grace and about a promise that had gone unkept. "Let me sleep a few hours," he said finally. "Then we talk about who they are and how many and when they're coming. All of it." Eliza nodded. She pulled a thin blanket from a chest near the wall and held it out to him without comment, with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone who had moved past the stage of being surprised when strange men appeared out of the dark and helped save what remained of her life. He took it. He sat down with his back against the wall where he could see the door and both windows at once. Old habits. Before he closed his eyes, he looked at Eliza once more. She had settled back beside Nathan without a word, and within minutes her breathing had deepened into sleep, her small hands still loosely wrapped around his larger one. Something nagged at him. Something in the shape of her face in the lamplight, a quality he could not quite name. Not recognition exactly. Something adjacent to it. The familiarity of a face that resembles another face you knew in a different time, in a different place before the world rearranged itself into its current configuration. He filed it away. Grief played tricks. He knew this better than most. He closed his eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The temperature continued its steady fall toward whatever the night had decided the floor would be. And in a cabin 8 miles north of Millstone Creek, a man who had spent 3 years becoming unreachable sat with his back against a fortified wall and found somewhat to his own surprise that he was no longer certain he wanted to leave. In the morning, Nathan Croft's eyes would open clear for the first time, and he would look at Caleb across the room with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just decided finally to set it down. Nathan Croft's fever broke on the morning of the 3rd day. Caleb had been awake for most of it, rotating between the firing ports and the bedside, with the mechanical patience of a man who had learned that vigilance was the only prayer he still knew how to offer. The fever had peaked somewhere around midnight of the second night, Nathan's body producing a heat that was almost frightening to the touch, his breathing becoming ragged and uneven in ways that made Caleb sit very still and count the seconds between each exhale. Eliza had stayed awake beside him until well past midnight, holding her father's hand and speaking to him in a low, continuous murmur that Caleb could not hear clearly and did not try to. Whatever she was saying, it was between the two of them. He had no place in it. She had finally fallen asleep in the chair beside the bed somewhere before dawn, her head tilting forward onto her chest. In sleep, she looked precisely what she was, a 9-year-old child. The composed, forward-facing competence she wore during her waking hours dissolved entirely, and what remained underneath was simply a little girl who was exhausted in ways that went considerably deeper than the physical. Caleb had put a blanket over her without waking her and gone back to watching the tree line. When Nathan's eyes finally opened clear and focused on the morning of the third day, with the thin winter light coming through the firing port slits and lying in pale stripes across the rough plank floor, the man lay still for a long moment, orienting himself. Then his gaze moved to Caleb sitting in the chair across the room, and something settled in his expression that was not quite trust, but was at least the recognition that immediate threat was absent. "You stayed," Nathan said. His voice was rough from disuse and fever scraped raw around the edges. "I said I would." Nathan absorbed this. "Why?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, looking at the man on the bed and at the child asleep beside him, and at the fortified walls around them all, and at the light coming through the narrow slits in a pattern that would shift and lengthen as the morning advanced toward noon. "3 years ago," he said, "I was a United States Marshal in a town called Redemption Creek, 40 miles south of here." Something moved in Nathan Croft's eyes. Not surprise exactly, something more complicated than surprise. "I know Redemption Creek," he said carefully. "I had my forge there, near the church." "Then you might remember my wife." Caleb kept his voice level, the way he always kept his voice level, when he said these words through 3 years of practice in keeping level the things that most wanted not to be. Her name was Grace Harrow. She taught at the schoolhouse. The change in Nathan's face was immediate and unmistakable. Recognition, yes, but under the recognition, moving up through it like water through cracked stone, something else. A weight, a gravity of knowledge that had been held for a long time and had not gotten lighter with the holding. "I remember her," Nathan said. His voice had changed quality. "She was kind. She brought food to families that didn't have enough. She stayed late at the schoolhouse to teach children whose parents couldn't pay. She did." A silence. "She and Clara were close," Nathan said. "They walked home together in the evenings, after Clara finished her work and Grace finished at the school. They trusted each other." Caleb sat forward in the chair, his forearms on his knees, his hands loose. Everything in him had gone very still in the way of a man who has been moving toward a door for 3 years and has just heard for the first time the sound of someone on the other side. "And the night Grace was killed," he said, "Clara was there." The words fell into the room like stones dropped into deep water. Caleb did not move. He was aware of the morning light on the floor, of the sound of Eliza's breathing from the chair beside the bed, of the cold pressing against the cabin walls from outside. He was aware of his own heartbeat, which had shifted into a different register, slower and heavier than usual, the rhythm of a man who is absorbing something that changes the shape of what he thought he knew. "Tell me," he said. Nathan told him. Not in a single continuous narrative, because that was not how such things came out when they had been carried long enough to become part of a man's bones. They came out in pieces with silences between them that were not hesitations but resting places, the way a man sets down a heavy load for a moment before picking it up again and continuing. Caleb listened to each piece and placed it beside the others and watched the picture form. In April of 1883, Grace Harrow had discovered something she was not supposed to discover. She had noticed it first in small irregularities, shipments arriving at odd hours, money moving through the town's commerce in patterns that made no logical sense, certain men behaving with a careful, controlled casualness that she had recognized from long observation as the performance of people who wanted to appear to have nothing to hide. She had followed the thread carefully, the way careful people follow threads they suspect might lead somewhere dangerous, and it had led her to records. Shipping manifests, receipts, documentation of an operation moving illegal weapons to armed groups and tainted morphine to Chinese laborers on the railroad lines north of town run by and for the benefit of the men who held the legitimate structures of power in Redemption Creek. It was enough to destroy them entirely if it reached the right hands. Grace had gone to Clara first. She had wanted advice on how to proceed, whether to wait for Caleb to return from his trip to Helena, or whether to find another way to get the documents to someone who could act on them. Clara had counseled waiting, had said it was safer to put the evidence directly in Caleb's hands, had walked home with Grace that evening to make sure she arrived safely. They were 2 blocks from the house. Cole Deaton and had called Grace's name from behind them. She had stopped and turned. He said he needed to speak with her about a matter at the school. She said it could wait until morning. He said it could not. Clara had felt something wrong in the way he was standing, in the way his hand kept moving toward the gun at his hip without quite touching it, and she had grabbed Grace's arm and said they needed to go now. Then Deaton had drawn his weapon. No warning, no ultimatum, just the gun coming out of the holster in one smooth, practiced motion, and then the sound of it, and then Grace on the ground. Clara had screamed. Deaton had turned the gun toward her. She had run cutting through an alley she knew because she had walked past it 100 times, hiding behind a stack of freight crates and pressing herself flat against the cold wood, her hand over her own mouth to contain the sound she was making. Watching through a gap between the crates as Deaton moved through the pool of lamplight and began the work of making a murder look like something else. He had torn Grace's dress and scattered her belongings in the dirt. He had taken her small coin purse. He had arranged the scene with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this kind of work before or had been told exactly what to do by someone who had. By the time he walked away, what had been a deliberate execution had become in the official record a random act of opportunistic violence. Clara had gone to Grace. She had already been gone. "Why didn't she come to me?" Caleb said. His voice was still level. He had made it level. It cost him something to do it, but he did it. The next morning, why didn't she come forward? "She went to the marshal's office," Nathan said. "You were already gone." Caleb closed his eyes for 3 seconds. He had left that morning, before dawn. He had suspected something was wrong in Redemption Creek for weeks, had been trying to build a case that was solid enough to survive the political resistance he knew it would encounter, and had decided that a direct trip to Helena to speak with the territorial authorities was the necessary next step. He had left before Grace was awake. He had kissed her hair in the dark without waking her and told himself he would be back in 4 days. He had been gone 3. "She waited for me to come back," he said. "She waited. But when you came back," Nathan paused, choosing his words with care, "you weren't the same man she needed to talk to. The whole town could see it. You were broken," Caleb said. "Yes. And the Hale organization was watching. Anyone I spoke to, anywhere I went." Clara was terrified. She had watched Grace die. She knew what these men were capable of, and she knew they would not stop at one. If she came forward, she was next. Nathan's jaw worked. "So she came to me instead. In the middle of the night, 3 days after you came back, she appeared at the forge with Eliza on her hip and everything she owned in a bag she could carry in one hand. And He stopped. "And you left with her," Caleb said. "I would have done anything for her." Nathan's voice carried no apology and no embarrassment, only the simple weight of the truth as he understood it. "Anything. I had been in love with her for years, since before Frank Briggs. I had watched what he did to her, and there was nothing I could do about it because she was married, and I was not the kind of man who involved himself in other men's marriages, regardless of what I thought about the man. But when she came to me that night, when she asked me to help her get away, there was nothing in the world that would have made me say no." Caleb was quiet. He looked at Eliza still asleep in the chair, her head tipped forward, her breathing soft and even. "Tell me about Frank Briggs," he said. Nathan told him about Frank Briggs. Briggs had come looking for them approximately 6 months after they settled in the cabin, following a trail Caleb could only assume had been laid for him by Douglas Hale, who had reasons of his own for wanting Clara found. He arrived drunk and loud and violent, which was apparently the state in which he most frequently operated, pounding on the cabin door and shouting that Clara was his wife and Eliza was his property, and he had come to retrieve what belonged to him. Nathan had tried to reason with him, had asked him to go sleep off the drink and come back in the morning if he still had things to say. Briggs had not been interested in reasoning. He had seen Eliza watching from the window, and something in him, some ugliness that lived in certain men who are given power over people smaller and more vulnerable than themselves, had decided that the most efficient way to demonstrate his authority over Clara was through the child. He grabbed her, Eliza's voice said. Both men looked at her. She was awake, sitting upright in the chair, her eyes fully open, with the immediate clarity of someone who does not ease gradually into consciousness, but arrives there all at once. She had been listening for some time, Caleb suspected, probably since before either of them realized it. "You don't have to," Nathan began. "He grabbed me," Eliza said again in the same flat factual tone she used for things she had already made a kind of peace with. "He was carrying me toward the old well behind the cabin. It had been dry for a year. He was holding me over the edge by one arm." A pause. He thought it was funny. Nathan's hands had closed into fists at his sides. "I hit him," Nathan said, "as hard as I could. He dropped her. She fell away from the well, not into it. She was safe." He looked at the ceiling. Then he came at me. We fought. We ended up near the forge. His head came down against the anvil. Silence. "I didn't intend to kill him," Nathan said. Not as a plea, as a statement of fact that he had apparently been carrying long enough that it had become simply part of the landscape of his life rather than a thing that required defense. "I wanted him to stop. That's the entirety of what I wanted. But the Hale organization called it murder," Caleb said. "First degree, premeditated. They said I had been conducting an affair with Clara for years, that I had always wanted her for myself, that I killed Briggs to steal his wife and child." Nathan's expression held a cold contempt that was clearly not new. It was elegant in its way. They discredited the witness, gave themselves a legal basis to hunt me down, and framed the entire thing as righteous law enforcement pursuing a violent criminal. Two problems solved with one charge. Caleb stood. He moved to the nearest firing port and looked out at the tree line, which was quiet and still in the pale morning light. His mind was moving in the focused, structured way it moved when he was working, when he was a marshal, and not a ghost, when pieces of evidence were arranging themselves into a coherent picture that demanded a response. And Clara, he said, she was still alive, still a witness, still a potential threat. For 2 more years, yes. Nathan's voice dropped. She was careful, she moved. She documented everything. She was building a record, names and dates, and specific details enough to take the entire structure down if it ever reached someone with the authority and the will to act on it. She told me once that she was writing it all down so that even if something happened to her, the truth would still exist somewhere. And then something did happen to her. A silence that lasted long enough to carry its own specific weight. Eliza spoke without being asked. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steadied when the steadiness is being maintained by a conscious effort that has become habitual. "I came back from the stream where I had been getting water. She was in the barn." A pause. There was a note. The note said she was sorry that she couldn't live with the guilt anymore, that she was choosing to end it. "But the note wasn't hers," Caleb said. "My mother's handwriting slants to the right," Eliza said. "It always has." The note slanted to the left, and she always signed her name with a small heart over the letter I in Clara. The note had no heart. The specific, particular details that only a child would notice. The details that adults, blunted by the larger catastrophes of their experience, tended to overlook in favor of the more obvious evidence. The details that would be dismissed by anyone who bothered to investigate as the grief-confused imagination of a traumatized 9-year-old. "The coroner ruled it suicide," Nathan said. "Case closed, and we were already fugitives. Who was going to listen to the word of a wanted murderer and an orphaned child?" Caleb stood at the firing port for a long moment, looking at the tree line, looking at nothing, feeling the shape of the thing that had been built and maintained in this territory for over a decade, the architecture of a system that converted murder into paperwork and buried the evidence under legal signatures and official seals. "4 days ago," he said, "the men who came. One of them was a deputy from Millstone Creek. I recognized him." Nathan touched his bandaged shoulder with 2 fingers, a minimal inventory gesture. "I got 2 of them before I got hit. The rest pulled back when I barricaded in here. But they know where we are. They'll come back with enough men to make the math work in their favor." "How much time do you think we have?" "Days, not many." Caleb nodded, once made a decision that he did not announce, and said, "I'm going into town. I need to know what we're actually dealing with." Nathan looked at him steadily. "You'll be walking into their territory. I've been in worse places. They'll make you. I've changed a lot in 3 years." Caleb touched the scar along his jaw, briefly unconsciously. "And I know how to be unremarkable when I need to be." Eliza, who had been listening to all of this with the quality of attention she brought to everything, said, "You're coming back." It was not quite a question. I promised I would stay until this was finished, he said. I meant it. She looked at him for a long moment with those two old eyes. People break promises. Some do. He held her gaze. I don't. Not anymore. He spent 30 minutes preparing, changing into his most anonymous clothing, checking the colt with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood that inattention in this area had terminal consequences. In the small mirror above the wash basin, he looked at the face looking back at him and found it adequately unfamiliar. 3 years of weather and grief and roads had done their work. The man who had worn a badge in Redemption Creek was not quite visible in this face. Good. He was almost to the door when Eliza said his name. He turned. She was standing in the middle of the room, small and straight, with something in her hands. It was a box, wooden worn smooth with years of handling. She opened it and removed 2 photographs, holding them out to him. My mother left these, she said, in case something happened to her. He took them. The first was a family photograph. Nathan younger and recognizably less burdened. A woman blonde-haired pretty holding an infant with the careful tenderness of new mothers. He looked at the woman's face. Clara Croft. He had the same feeling he had experienced the previous night while watching Eliza sleep, the same quality of indirect recognition, the sense of something familiar glimpsed at an angle rather than straight on. He set it aside and looked at the second photograph. This one was older. The woman in it was Clara, again younger, perhaps 19 or 20. She stood next to a man he did not recognize, broader and harder faced than Nathan. But that was not what made Caleb's hand tighten, almost imperceptibly, on the edge of the photograph. Written on the back, in handwriting he did not recognize, were 3 words and a year. Clara and Jacob, 1882. He turned it back over and looked at Clara Croft's face in the older photograph. The angle of the light, the slight tilt of the head, the shape of the eyes and the line of the cheekbone. The feeling intensified without clarifying. He set it aside. He had work to do, and the work required a clear head. I'll be back before dark, he said and left. Millstone Creek looked different in full daylight. Smaller, more ordinary, less ominous. But Caleb had spent enough years in places where ordinary surfaces concealed extraordinary damage to know that the ordinariness of a thing was entirely compatible with its rot. He tied Ash outside the saloon, ordered whiskey at the bar, paid with coins, and said nothing beyond what was necessary. The bartender poured without comment. 2 old men played cards in a far corner. A woman in a faded dress swept the floor near the back wall. He was nursing his second whiskey and preparing for the kind of careful, patient listening that sometimes yielded more than direct questioning when the door opened and a young man walked in. 28 years old, perhaps, a deputy's badge catching the late afternoon light, dark hair and a clean-shaved face and eyes that moved through the room with the constant, systematic assessment of someone who had been trained to read spaces rather than simply occupy them. He took the stool 2 down from Caleb with the deliberate positioning of someone who understood the geometry of a room. They drank in silence for a few minutes. Then the deputy said, without looking at him, in a voice pitched low enough to stay between them, "You're the one who brought the girl back." Not a question. "I don't know what you're talking about," Caleb said. "Eliza, 9 years old, lives with a wanted man 8 miles north of here. She was in town 3 days ago asking for help. You followed her home." The deputy turned his glass slowly on the bar. "I keep track of what happens in this town. It's my job." "Then you must stay busy. Busier than I'd like." A pause. "The question isn't what you did. The question is who you are." Caleb considered the angles available to him. Silence would close this conversation. Opening it carried risks that he could not fully quantify. But a man who had been watching Eliza and knew what she was doing and where she lived and had not reported it to the people who wanted Nathan Croft dead was either building towards something or was exactly what he appeared to be, which was a young man carrying a weight he had not figured out how to set down. "What would you say," Caleb said carefully, "if I told you I thought the girl and her father were innocent?" The sound Owen Reed made was too bitter and too knowing to qualify as laughter. "I'd say innocent is a funny word for around here. It doesn't get much use." "It should." "Should and does are different things." Reed looked into his glass. "You want to know about should? 3 years ago, a woman was killed in Redemption Creek, shot in the back by Cole Deaton on orders from Douglas Hale because she found out things she wasn't supposed to find out. I know this because I was there." He paused. "I was Deaton's deputy. I saw it happen, and I said nothing." Caleb's pulse had shifted into something quieter and more focused. "I said nothing because I was 25 years old and I wanted to live," Reed said. That's the truth of it. I've been living with that truth ever since, and I can tell you it has not improved with age. Why are you telling me this? Reed finally looked at him directly. His eyes held the exhaustion of a man who has been fighting a war entirely inside himself for a long time and has not been winning it. Because Douglas Hale is my cousin, my mother's sister's son. We grew up together. I thought he was everything a man should be when I was a boy. His jaw tightened. It took me years to understand what he actually was. And by the time I understood it, I had been part of it long enough that walking away wasn't as simple as just walking away. But you've been gathering evidence. A pause. For 2 years. Documents. Testimonies from people too frightened to speak publicly. Records of every crime, every falsified report, every act of corruption and murder. Enough to destroy them, both Douglas and his brother Warren the judge. Then why haven't you used it? Because I need someone they don't own to present it. Someone with federal authority. Reed looked at him steadily. Someone like a United States Marshal. The silence that followed was complete. Former, Caleb said. The authority doesn't expire. The commission doesn't require the badge to be in one piece. Reed leaned slightly forward. I've known who you were since you rode into Town Harrow. I recognized you. I've been waiting for someone like you for 2 years. Maybe I've been waiting specifically for you. Caleb sat with this for a long moment, looking at the bar surface, feeling the weight of what was being offered and what was being asked in the same gesture. There's something else, Reed said. Something I found out recently about Eliza. Caleb looked at him. Frank Briggs was sterile. Childhood illness. Everybody in the county knew it the way people know things in small places without ever saying them directly. When Clara got pregnant, Briggs convinced himself it was a miracle. He wanted a child badly enough to believe something that any rational examination would have told him was impossible. Caleb went very still. He started to figure it out eventually, Reed continued. Started counting months and noticing things. Noticing that Eliza looked nothing like him, not a single feature. Noticing that the dates didn't quite add up the way he had been telling himself they did. Reed's voice was flat and careful, the voice of a man reporting facts that he finds repugnant but necessary. 5 years ago, when Briggs was in jail for a month after a bar fight, Clara was alone in Millstone Creek. Vulnerable. And Douglas Hale, who had just been appointed sheriff and was operating with the particular sense of immunity that the position gave him, saw his opportunity. The full shape of it arrived in Caleb's mind all at once, the way certain realizations come not gradually but completely, like a lamp being lit in a dark room. Eliza is Hale's daughter, he said. By blood, not by anything else. Reed's voice held a cold fury that was clearly not new. When Briggs finally accepted what he had been refusing to accept, he came to the cabin to deal with what he saw as the problem. A child who proved he had been made a fool of. A child who was walking evidence of something Douglas Hale could not afford to have known. Nathan killed him protecting her, and Hale got everything he needed from it. The witness discredited, the protector hunted as a murderer. The one remaining problem, the child herself still alive and unaccounted for. Reed paused. They can't let her live Harrow, not because of anything she knows or anything she's done, just because she exists. Caleb stood, the chair scraped back on the plank floor. He needed air. He needed the brief, insufficient clarification that cold air sometimes provided when the mind was working through something that was too large for comfortable interior processing. How long before they come, he said. 2 or 3 days. Hale is assembling a full crew, 20 men, maybe more. He's done being careful about it. Then we don't have time to run. No? Caleb moved toward the door, then stopped. Turn back. Why now, he said. Why come forward now after 2 years of waiting? Reed was quiet for a moment. Because I'm tired of being the reason good people die when they don't have to. And because you walked into this town and followed a 9-year-old girl home through a frozen forest at night without being asked twice, and that told me something about the kind of man you are. It was not a comfortable thing to be told, and Caleb did not receive it comfortably. I'll be at the cabin, he said, if you're going to help come before dark, and bring someone you trust to ride for Helena with the documents. He rode back through the fading afternoon under a sky that had deepened from gray to the particular shade of charcoal that precedes a serious snowfall. His mind was working with a focused clarity that had been largely absent for 3 years, the specific quality of attention that engaged when a problem had become concrete enough to address rather than simply large enough to suffer. He found Nathan sitting up when he returned, which was an improvement. He found Eliza at the firing port watching the tree line with the systematic attention of someone who had been taught or had taught herself that vigilance was the primary survival skill. He told them everything Reed had told him. He watched their faces as he spoke. When he finished, Nathan looked at him with the steady, careful attention of a man processing information that changes the shape of what he thought he understood. So they're coming regardless. Yes. Running north would give us 3 days on open ground with men who know the territory better than we do. Yes. And Helena is too far. There isn't time. Caleb moved to the table and sat down. But there may be another way. If we can expose them here in front of witnesses with the evidence Reed has been collecting, the calculation changes. A man who has confessed his crimes in public cannot simply have the witnesses killed without generating the kind of attention that even a territorial judge cannot suppress. "In Clara's diary," Nathan said quietly. "She told me she wrote down everything, all of it." "Eliza," Caleb said, "your mother told you where she hid it." The girl had been listening with the quality of focused attention she brought to everything. She looked at him steadily. "Near the tree," she said, "the one in the clearing. She told me that if something happened to her, I should go to the tree and look at the roots on the north side." Caleb nodded slowly. "We'll need to retrieve it before Hale arrives." He paused. "Tonight when Reed comes, I'll send him north to the oak with your directions. He can have it in hand before dawn." Nathan was watching him. "You're staying," he said. It was not a question. "I told you I would. You could ride for Helena and send someone back. That would take too long." He paused. "And I have my own reasons to be here when this ends." That night, after Nathan had slept again, and the cabin had settled into its nocturnal quiet, Eliza appeared at his side while he sat outside in the cold, his back against the wall, watching the stars that had appeared in the gaps between the clouds. She sat down beside him without asking permission, drew a blanket around her shoulders, and looked up at the sky with a composed attentiveness she brought to most things. After a while, she said, "Do you think God forgives people who kill bad men?" Caleb considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, coming from a 9-year-old who was asking it from direct personal experience rather than theological curiosity. "I used to think I knew the answer to that," and he said. "When I wore the badge, things seemed clearer, right and wrong, legal and not. But the longer I've lived, the more I think that kind of clarity is sometimes less about truth and more about not having seen enough yet." "What did your wife think?" The question arrived in him in a specific place. She believed that the measure of a person wasn't whether they ever had to do hard things, he said, but whether the reason they did them was love or something smaller. Eliza thought about this. "I think what Papa did was love," she said. "So do I." She leaned against him, then just slightly. Just the small weight of her shoulder against his arm, the instinctive seeking of warmth and contact that even the most self-sufficient of children could not entirely educate themselves out of. Caleb sat very still, not wanting to disrupt whatever had allowed this small, careful person to permit herself this small, careful comfort. He looked down at her, at the blonde hair catching what little moonlight filtered through the clouds at the angle of her face and profile. The feeling came again, stronger this time. That sense of something known seen from an unfamiliar angle. That quality of the bone structure around her eyes and across her cheekbones that nagged at him with the persistence of something just outside the range of conscious recognition. He had looked at Clara Croft's photographs twice now. He had felt this each time. He could not explain it and could not make it resolve into anything nameable. So he set it aside again. The way he set aside the things he could not yet use and returned his attention to the tree line and the night. Owen Reed arrived at the cabin 2 hours after midnight, moving through the dark with the careful silence of a man who had spent years learning to move through spaces that did not want him noticed. Caleb met him at the edge of the cleared ground and spoke to him for 10 minutes, his voice low and even. Reed listened, nodded once, and took the directions Caleb had written on a scrap of paper from Nathan's table. "The diary is buried at the roots of the oak on the north side," Caleb said. "Clara's own words, every crime Douglas Hale has committed in this territory for 10 years. Names, dates, locations. Get it in your hands tonight." "And Warren," Reed said. "Warren reads it before the morning. All of it. That is the hinge everything else turns on." Reed left without further discussion, moving back into the tree line and disappearing as quietly as he had come. Caleb returned to his position against the wall and sat there until before dawn, when Eliza shook him awake. "There's someone in the forest," she said. Her voice was completely level, not frightened, reporting. Caleb was on his feet before the sentence was finished. He moved to the firing port and looked out at the tree line in the gray pre-dawn light. For a moment he saw nothing. Then he saw the movement, or rather the absence of it, the specific stillness of shapes that were not natural to the landscape and were making a studied effort not to be. "Nathan," he said low and even. "Positions." Nathan was already moving, crossing to the western firing port with the careful, pain-managed efficiency of a man who had been conserving his strength for exactly this kind of moment. Eliza took the northern position without being told, her eyes to the slit, her voice quiet and precise. "North side, 3 men visible, possibly more behind. West," Nathan said, 5 spreading out along the tree line. Caleb watched the south approach. He saw them come out of the trees. 6 men in the vanguard, walking slowly and deliberately, making no attempt at concealment. They wanted to be seen. They wanted the people inside the cabin to understand what was happening in a way that would precede the shooting, that would give the terror time to work on the mind before the violence began. And in the center of the 6, tall and unhurried, walking with the casual authority of a man who had never been forced to move faster than he chose to, was the figure that Caleb had been carrying in his mind for 3 years, built from fragments and shadows, and the careful testimony of people who flinched when they said the name. Douglas Hale, 45 years old, dark-haired with silver at the temples, a face that was handsome in the cold, sharp-edged way of men who had arranged their lives to preclude the kind of disappointment that softens faces. He wore a sheriff's badge that caught the thin morning light and a gun at his hip, and moved across the frozen ground with the ease of someone who had never been required to doubt that the ground beneath him belonged to him by right. 3 years. 3 years of roads and questions and towns that didn't know or wouldn't say. 3 years of Grace's ring against his sternum and her face in the river's reflection and the 2 halves of a broken badge in his coat pocket. 3 years of being the kind of man who couldn't stop and couldn't quite start, either suspended between the person he had been and the person that night in April had made him. And here was the man at the center of it, standing in the clearing outside the cabin, about to call for a child to be handed over to her own destruction. Nathan Croft. Hale's voice carried across the clearing in the cold morning air. Smooth and measured, the voice of someone accustomed to being the loudest authority in any room he occupied. "I know you're in there, and I know you're not alone. I want to make this simple for everyone involved." Inside the cabin, Eliza had gone very still. Hale continued. "Send out the girl, just her. No one else needs to be hurt today. She is my blood. My daughter and I have a right to raise her properly. Give her a real life. What can you give her, Nathan? Another year running, watching you die by inches from those wounds." Caleb looked at Eliza. Her face was a careful, controlled arrangement of composure over something that was working very hard not to show itself. "Maybe I should go," she said very quietly. "No," Nathan said, from across the room. Absolute, final, the single syllable carrying more weight than most complete sentences. And Caleb, watching her, watching the man on the far side of the fortified wall who had set this entire machinery in motion, felt something settle into place in his chest. A decision, clear and cold and unambiguous in the way that only certain decisions were the ones that had been forming for a long time beneath the surface of conscious choice and had finally arrived fully made. He checked the Colt. 6 rounds. "I'm going out there," he said. He did not wait for the argument. He moved to the door and put his hand on the iron bolt. Outside, Douglas Hale was still waiting for his answer. Still confident, still unhurried, still unaware that 3 years of a dead woman's husband had just arrived at his door. That was about to change. Caleb opened the door and walked out into the cold. The air hit him like a physical thing, sharp and clean and indifferent to whatever was about to happen in it. He moved slowly across the cleared ground, hands visible at his sides, his body angled with the automatic economy of someone who had spent decades understanding that posture communicated things that words could not. He was not surrendering. He was not fleeing. He was walking toward something that had been walking toward him for 3 years, and the quality of his pace said so. He counted the guns as he crossed the open ground. 14 visible. More at the tree line, shapes that were too deliberate in their stillness to be anything other than men waiting for a signal. 20 at minimum, probably more. He kept walking. Douglas Hale watched him approach with the expression of a man who has been presented with an unexpected variable and is determining with practiced speed how to reclassify it. Surprise moved across his face and was replaced within 2 seconds by the smooth, controlled neutrality of someone who had learned long ago that visible reaction was a form of vulnerability. Caleb stopped at 30 paces, close enough to read the man's eyes, far enough that the distance offered the illusion of negotiation rather than confrontation. "I don't know you," Hale said. "You should." Caleb kept his voice level and unhurried, the voice of a man who has nothing to prove and knows it. "Caleb Harrow, United States Marshal." Something shifted in Hale's face. The name arrived in him, visibly working through layers of recognition and calculation before he composed his expression back to its habitual blankness. "Former Marshal, if I recall correctly," Hale said. "Lost his commission after his wife's death. Emotional instability." "My wife was murdered," Caleb said, by Cole Deaton, "on your orders, because she found out what you were running through Redemption Creek." "That's a serious accusation without evidence to support it." "Clara Croft saw the entire thing," Caleb said. "She was there. She watched Deaton shoot Grace in the back and then arrange the scene to look like a robbery. She wrote all of it down. Every detail, every name, every crime you've committed in this territory for the past 10 years. Names, dates, locations, documentation. Enough to hang you twice over." Hale's eyes did not change. His voice did not change. But something in the region of his jaw tightened by a fraction of an inch. "Clara Croft is dead." "Yes, also murdered. Also on your orders. The coroner's verdict of suicide was falsified, which is itself a crime that your brother signed his name to." Caleb watched the man's face carefully. "The diary has already been retrieved. It's in the hands of someone who knows what to do with it. Federal marshals will be reading it before nightfall." For a long moment, nothing moved. The men at the tree line held their positions. The men in the clearing stood with the controlled readiness of people waiting for a signal that had not yet been given. The cold morning air moved through the space between the two men without choosing sides. Then Hale smiled. It was not a pleasant thing to observe. "You want to know the truth, Harrow?" His voice had shifted register, something dropping away from it that had been performing a certain kind of restraint. "Fine, yes. I gave the order for Grace Harrow. She was a problem that needed solving, and I solved it. That is how the world works. The strong make decisions, and the weak become the consequences of those decisions. Your wife chose to involve herself in things that were not her concern, and she paid the price that that choice carried." He took a step forward. "Clara Croft saw something she should not have seen, and she paid the same price. These are not crimes. These are the necessary mechanisms of order in a territory that would have collapsed into chaos without men willing to make hard decisions." His voice held a contempt so practiced and so complete that it had become indistinguishable from conviction. "And the child is mine, my blood, and I will have her." Caleb let the words settle into the cold air. He did not respond to them immediately. Instead, he did something that Hale clearly had not anticipated. He turned his head slightly and looked at the men standing in the clearing around them. 23 men, deputies and hired guns, and men who wore badges that implied obligations they had apparently decided were optional. Men who had signed up to be officers of the law and had found themselves standing in a frozen clearing while their employer confessed to multiple murders in front of them. "You all heard that," Caleb said. Not loudly, not as an accusation, simply as a statement of fact being entered into the record. Every word of it. Several of the men exchanged glances. The glance of people who are reassessing the situation they are standing in. Hale's expression shifted. The smooth neutrality cracked along a specific line, the line between calculation and fury, and for just a moment the thing underneath was visible. Then he brought it back under control and said in a voice sharpened to an edge, "Take him." The men did not move. Not all of them. Not immediately. Some did, hands going to weapons bodies, beginning the adjustment of people preparing to carry out an order. But enough of them did not that the space in the clearing became something different from what Hale had designed it to be. It became uncertain, and in that uncertainty a gap opened. Caleb drew and fired in the same motion. The shot took Hale in the right shoulder and spun him sideways, his own weapon half drawn and then falling from fingers that had lost their function. He went down onto one knee in the frozen dirt, his face registering something that might have been pain and might have been the shock of a man who has never genuinely believed that consequences apply to him experiencing one for the first time. The clearing erupted, men moving in multiple directions, shouting, the sound of weapons being readied and the countervailing sound of men deciding that the mathematics of the situation had changed in ways they had not agreed to when they signed on. 3 of Hale's deputies leveled their weapons at Caleb. He held his ground. The Colt still raised, everything in him going very quiet in the way it always had in moments like this. the noise and movement around him becoming something he moved through rather than something that moved him. Then a new voice cut across the clearing with the authority of someone accustomed to being the final word in any room. "Douglas, that is enough." Every head turned. He stood at the eastern edge of the clearing, having emerged from the tree line during the confusion, with the quiet deliberateness of a man who has chosen his moment carefully. 52 years old, silver-haired, the bearing of a man who had spent decades wearing authority like a second skin. He wore a judge's coat and carried himself with the upright, considered posture of someone who had made a life out of being the heaviest presence in any given space. Warren Hale, the territorial judge, Douglas Hale's older brother, the man whose signature appeared on every falsified document, every closed investigation, every piece of official paperwork that had converted murder into administrative procedure for the better part of a decade. He walked into the clearing at a measured pace, his eyes moving from his brother kneeling in the dirt to Caleb standing over him to the cabin at the far end of the open ground. His face held something that was not simple emotion and could not be reduced to it. The expression of a man looking at the architecture of choices he had made over many years and finding in the full light of their consequences that the structure he had built was not what he had believed he was building. Behind him, Owen Reed stepped out of the trees, not surprised, not nervous. Reed had positioned himself there, deliberately had ridden hard after retrieving the diary and taken up his position in the dark hours before dawn, waiting for the moment that had now arrived. His deputy's badge caught the morning light. His face was set with the resolution of someone who has decided that the cost of continuing to live with a particular compromise is higher than the cost of stopping. "Owen came to my chambers last night," Warren said. His voice was steady, carefully, deliberately steady in the way of a man holding something in check by main force of will. "He brought me the diary," Clara Croft's own words. "It's fabricated," Douglas said from the ground. His voice had lost its smoothness. The pain was in it now, and under the pain something uglier, the flat, hard sound of a man who has never been genuinely cornered before and does not know how to be it gracefully. Every word of it is fabricated by a man who has a personal grievance against this office. "Is it?" Warren reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a small book worn at the corners. The leather cover darkened with age and handling. He held it up. "Owen retrieved this last night from where it was buried near the oak tree in the forest clearing, using directions Eliza Croft provided. Clara Croft's diary, her own words in her own hand. He opened it to a page he had already marked. Would you like me to read it aloud, so that everyone present can hear what Clara Croft wrote on the night of April 14th, 1883? Douglas said nothing. Warren read. His voice carried across the clearing in the cold morning air, even and clear without dramatic inflection, which made it more devastating than any performance could have been. Just the words themselves in the order Clara had written them, the handwriting of a woman who had been frightened and precise and determined that what she had seen would not be lost simply because she was. "Tonight I watched Grace Harrow die. I watched Cole Deaton shoot her in the back on the orders of Douglas Hale because she had found the truth about what he is and what he has been doing in this territory. She was innocent. She was the best person I knew in this place. And she died because she believed that the truth was worth something, that the law was supposed to protect people like her, that the men who wore badges were supposed to be different from the men who didn't. I am writing this down because I cannot carry it alone and I cannot speak it safely. Someday someone will read these words. Someday someone will know what happened here. I am writing this so that Grace Harrow's death is not simply absorbed into the silence that Douglas Hale has been building around himself for years. She deserved better than silence. She deserved the truth to outlast the men who killed her." Warren lowered the book. The clearing was entirely quiet. Douglas Hale was looking at his brother with an expression that moved through several registers in quick succession. Disbelief, calculation, something that might have been a plea and was quickly overridden by something harder. "Warren, you don't understand the full picture. You never had to make the decisions I made. You sat in your courtroom and signed the papers I put in front of you, and you didn't ask questions because you didn't want answers. And now you're going to stand there and—" "How many?" Warren's voice did not rise. It dropped, became quieter, became more absolute. "How many people, Douglas? Not the official number, not the closed cases and the filed reports. How many?" Douglas said nothing. "Grace Harrow," Warren said. "Clara Croft, the Chinese laborer who survived the morphine but disappeared before he could testify. The cattle rancher near the Yellowstone who was going to report the weapons shipments. The woman in Billings whose name I found in Clara's diary, whose death I signed off on as a riding accident. He paused. How many more that I don't know about yet? The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Warren turned to Owen Reed. Deputy Reed, place my brother under arrest. Reed moved forward with the steady, unhurried pace of a man doing something he has been preparing to do for a long time. He reached Douglas with the handcuffs already in his hand. Douglas Hale looked up at his brother with something that had finally shed all its protective coverings and was simply what it was underneath. Not remorse, not fear exactly. The raw, exposed look of a man who has built his entire existence on the premise that the rules apply to other people and has just discovered in the most concrete possible terms that this premise was wrong. I am not going to Helena in chains, he said. I am not going to stand in a territorial court and be judged by men who... He moved for his weapon with the desperation of a man making the only choice he had left. He was not fast enough. Caleb fired. Reed fired. Two of the deputies who had not moved when Hale gave his order, the men who had listened to their employer confess to multiple murders and had made their own determination about what their badges actually meant, fired as well. Douglas Hale fell. He fell in the way that men fall when the fall is final without the reflexive reaching for recovery that accompanies survivable violence. He went down into the frozen dirt of the clearing he had ridden across with such deliberate confidence 20 minutes earlier, and the ground received him with the complete indifference that the ground extends to all things equally the powerful and the powerless alike. Caleb stood very still for a moment. He had been carrying the name Douglas Hale for 3 years. He had been carrying the weight of what that name represented. The gun in the back street, the staged robbery, the closed case and the cold house and the ring on the leather cord that he had not been able to look at. He had constructed a version of this moment in his mind many times during those 3 years, and in the construction, he had always imagined feeling something specific and definitive. When it arrived, some resolution that had the quality of a door finally closing. What he felt instead was quieter than that. Not empty, not hollow, just very still in the way that a room is still after a sound that has been constant for a long time finally stops. He walked to where Douglas Hale had fallen. He told himself afterward that he did not know why he crouched down beside the body. It was not respect and it was not sentiment. Perhaps it was the instinct of a man who had spent his life at scenes of violence and had learned to look carefully rather than away. Perhaps it was something else, something that operated below the level of conscious intention. Whatever the reason, he saw it. A cord around Hale's neck disappearing beneath the blood-soaked shirt. Leather thin, the kind used for pendants and keepsakes. Caleb reached out and drew it over the man's head. A locket, small silver worn to a soft patina by years of handling. He turned it in his fingers for a moment before opening it. It was the kind of locket a man kept not from love, but from possession, the way certain men cataloged the things they had wanted and taken and the things they had wanted and could not have. A trophy carried close to the body, a reminder of power exercised and power desired. He opened it. Inside were 2 photographs side by side in the twin frames of the locket's interior. Small, slightly faded with age, but clear enough for the details to be legible. The left side held a photograph of a young woman. Blonde hair, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, with a face that was pretty and strong, and held an expression that was almost defiant in its directness, as though she were looking at the camera and finding it insufficient. Written in pencil on the interior of the locket frame beneath it in handwriting, he did not recognize Clara 1879. Caleb looked at this photograph for a moment. He had seen Clara Croft's face in the photographs Eliza had shown him. He recognized her. Then he looked at the right side. The same face, the same bone structure, the same angle of the cheekbones, the same shape of the eyes, the same quality of direct, slightly challenging gaze. But the dress was different. The background was different. The light was different. And written beneath it, in the same penciled hand, my grace. The world did not move. The clearing did not move. The cold air did not shift. Everything continued exactly as it had been a moment before, occupying the same space in the same configuration. Caleb Harrow did not move for a very long time. He looked at the left photograph. He looked at the right, left, right. He was looking for the difference that would make this something other than what it appeared to be. The detail that would resolve the impossible into the merely coincidental, the trick of light or age or grief, distorted perception that would explain how 2 photographs of 2 different women could look exactly, precisely, feature by feature, identical. He did not find it, because there was no trick. There was no distortion. There were no two different women. There was one face, and it belonged to two people who had been the same person once in the way that only one specific biological circumstance produces. Twins, Grace had told him once. In the dark of their bedroom in Redemption Creek, in one of those late-night conversations that exist between people who have made a genuine life together, when the guards are down and the things carried privately are permitted to be spoken. She had told him about the sister she had lost when they were 15. The twin sister who had run from their father, whose violence was the one thing both sisters agreed could not be endured and had never come back. Grace had searched for years, had placed notices in newspapers across the territory, had never stopped believing entirely that the sister was out there somewhere, that the story was not finished. Her sister's name had been Clara. Caleb sat back on his heels in the frozen dirt of the clearing, and the full weight of it came down on him all at once with the comprehensive, breathtaking force of something that has been true for a long time finally being understood. Grace had been looking for Clara her entire adult life. She had died never knowing that Clara had been 40 miles away in a town called Millstone Creek, married to a man named Nathan Croft, raising a daughter with her mother's blonde hair and her mother's quality of attention and her mother's way of holding her head when she was thinking. Clara had been looking in her own frightened and careful way for the right moment to come forward to find someone trustworthy enough to carry what she knew. She had died without finding that moment. And between them, the two sisters who had never found each other, they had left behind one person, Eliza. Caleb looked toward the cabin. She was standing in the open doorway, small against the frame, watching the clearing with the steady, measuring attention she brought to everything. She had come out when the shooting stopped moving to the threshold with the careful wariness of someone who understood that the ending of one kind of danger did not automatically preclude the beginning of another. Their eyes met across the open ground. He stood. His legs were not entirely steady, which was unusual for him. He walked toward her, and as he walked, the distance between them shortened, and the face he was walking toward resolved itself more clearly with each step, and the thing that had been nagging at him since the first night, since the firelight in the cabin, and the way she held her head and the quality of her composure finally arrived in full. He had not been seeing the ghost of Clara in her face. He had been seeing Grace. He reached her. He stopped. He opened the locket in his palm and held it out so she could see both photographs. She looked down at them. He watched her face as she looked, saw the recognition when it came the small, startled shift of her expression at the sight of her mother's face in the left frame. "That's my mother," she said. "Yes, but..." She stopped. She was looking at the right side now, at the face that was her mother's face and was not her mother. "Who is that?" "Her name was Grace Harrow," Caleb said. His voice did not cooperate entirely with his effort to keep it level. "She was my wife." Eliza looked up at him. "She was your mother's twin sister," he said. "They were separated when they were 15 years old. Grace spent her entire life trying to find Clara. She never stopped looking. She died not knowing that Clara was alive, not knowing she had a niece." He paused. "Not knowing that you existed." The silence that followed was of a different quality from all the silences that had preceded it. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, or who are being careful about what they say, or who are waiting for something. The silence of people standing at the edge of something they had not known existed until this moment, looking at it, beginning to understand what it meant. "She was looking for my mother," Eliza said, "her whole life. And my mother was 40 miles away." The specific cruelty of it had not diminished in the 30 seconds he had been carrying it. 40 miles, and they never found each other. Eliza looked at the locket again. She looked at the two faces side by side, separated by a sliver of silver and a distance that had never been bridged in life. Then she looked back up at him, and in her face he saw something he recognized because he had felt its counterpart arriving in his own chest during the walk across the clearing. The tentative, careful, almost frightened recognition of something that changes the shape of what a person thought they knew about who they were and who they belonged to. "Does that mean we're family?" she said. Caleb's throat worked. "You are my niece," he said, "by blood, by the sister I married and loved and lost. You are the last piece of Grace that exists in this world." He stopped, started again. "And I am making you a promise right now, Eliza. Not a careful promise, not the kind with room built in for failure. A real one. On Grace's memory, and on your mother's memory, and on everything I have left that is worth anything." His voice did not quite hold steady, and he did not try to make it. "You are my daughter from this moment, mine to protect, mine to raise, mine to love. No one will hurt you again. I will not allow it. Eliza threw her arms around him. It was not like the controlled, careful physicality she had shown throughout everything he had known of her. It was the full, unconditional surrender of a child who has been holding everything together through main force of will for too long and has finally been given permission to stop. She pressed her face against his coat, and her small shoulders shook with the force of something that had been building for a very long time, since long before he had found her running in the dark beside the river. Perhaps since the morning she had come back from the stream and found her mother gone. Caleb held her. He did not try to speak. He held her the way men hold the things that matter most when they understand finally and completely what it is they are holding. His own eyes were wet, and he made no effort to address this. Nathan appeared in the doorway behind Eliza. He had heard everything. His face held the composite expression of a man who is feeling too many things simultaneously for any one of them to be legible individually. Love and grief and relief and something that was almost peace, the peace of a man who has been fighting to protect something precious and has just seen it pass into hands he has decided to trust. He met Caleb's eyes over the top of Eliza's head. "Take care of her," Nathan said. "I will." Caleb held the man's gaze. "I swear it." The days that followed had the quality of aftermath, which is different from resolution and frequently more difficult. Resolution is a door closing. Aftermath is the work of determining what the closed door means and what, if anything, is on the other side of it. Warren Hale submitted his resignation from the territorial bench and presented himself to the federal authorities who arrived from Helena 4 days after the confrontation in the clearing, summoned by the documents Owen Reed had sent and arriving to find the situation considerably more advanced than anticipated. He cooperated fully and without condition. He answered every question put to him about every document he had signed and every crime he had been complicit in through the mechanism of looking the other way. "I cannot undo what was done," he said to Caleb in the single private conversation they had before the federal men took him north. "I cannot give back what my brother took. I can only tell you that what Clara Croft wrote in that diary, the account of what happened to your wife, will be part of the permanent official record. It will not be buried. It will not be lost. That is the only thing I have left to offer, and I am giving it." Caleb looked at the man for a long moment. "It's not enough," he said. "It can't be enough. You know that." "Yes," Warren said, "I do. But it's something." "Yes, it's something." Owen Reed was appointed acting sheriff of Millstone Creek by the federal authorities pending a formal appointment, process of development he received with the expression of a man who has been given exactly what he needs and is not sure he deserves it. He was 28 years old and had been carrying a specific weight since he was 25, and he would likely carry some part of it for the rest of his life, but he would carry it differently now. That was the most that could be said, and Caleb said it to him directly before he left. "In 10 years, Reed said, ask me if it was enough." "Ask yourself," Caleb said. "Don't wait for someone else to do it." Nathan Croft's charges were formally dismissed on the third day following the confrontation. The documentation of self-defense in the death of Frank Briggs, now fully corroborated by Clara's diary and by the testimony of the 2 surviving members of Hale's operation, who had decided with the notable alacrity that tends to accompany the collapse of a criminal enterprise that cooperation with federal authorities was the wiser available path. The dismissal came in writing, signed by a federal judge, and Owen Reed brought it to Nathan in person. Nathan held the document in his hands for a long time without speaking. Then he put it down carefully on the table and said, "It doesn't fix anything." "No," Caleb agreed. "Clara is still dead. 2 years of hiding, the wounds that aren't going to close the way wounds are supposed to." "No," Caleb said again. "It doesn't fix any of that." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "But Eliza is safe." "Yes, and she'll be taken care of. I've given her my word." Nathan nodded once, the single precise nod of a man who has evaluated a situation and found it as acceptable as it was going to get. "Then it's enough," he said. "It has to be enough." The infection in Nathan's wounds had been doing its slow, patient work throughout everything, continuing its progress without regard for the resolution of larger matters. The doctor from Millstone Creek who examined him the day after the confrontation was a careful man who told the truth without embellishment, which Caleb respected. He said that the wounds themselves were no longer the primary concern. The infection had spread. Rest was required. Weeks of it, possibly months. He did not say that rest might not be sufficient. He did not need to. The information was in his face, and in the specific, careful way he repacked his instruments and Nathan, who was not a fool, read it clearly. They moved Nathan to a room above the general store in Millstone Creek. The owner, an older woman named Margaret, who had known Clara in the years before everything had gone wrong, offered it without being asked and refused any discussion of payment. "It is not enough," she said quietly, "but it is what I have." Nathan spent those weeks teaching Eliza things he apparently believed she needed to know. How to manage accounts, how to read contracts and identify the language used to obscure unfair terms, how to negotiate from a position that appeared weaker than it was, how to stand her ground in a world that would consistently underestimate her, and to use that underestimation as an advantage rather than allowing it to become a limitation. Eliza sat beside him every day and listened with the complete attention she brought to everything, occasionally asking questions that surprised him with their precision, occasionally saying nothing for a long time, and then saying something that indicated she had been processing what she heard at a depth he had not entirely anticipated. "You're smarter than most adults I know," Nathan told her one evening. The light was going early the way it did in that season, the short days of late autumn compressing themselves toward the long nights of full winter. "I don't want to be smart," she said. "I just want you to get better." "I know, sweetheart. Is it not going to happen?" A pause that was its own kind of answer. "Some things we don't get to choose." She was quiet for a moment, then, "That doesn't seem fair." "No," Nathan said, "it doesn't." Caleb was present for most of these conversations, and for the ones he was not present for. Their shape was conveyed by the quality of Eliza's silence. In the hours afterward, the composure of someone absorbing something they do not want to absorb, but have decided to absorb honestly, rather than through the softening mechanism of denial. She was doing. Caleb understood what she had always done. She was choosing to see clearly rather than comfortably. She was choosing the truth even when the truth was the harder available option. He had known someone else who had made that choice habitually as a matter of character rather than effort. On the 14th day, Nathan's fever returned. It arrived in the afternoon with the decisiveness of something that had been waiting for the right moment, and by evening it was apparent to everyone in the room that it was not going to resolve the way the first fever had resolved. The doctor came and did what he could and spoke quietly with Caleb in the hallway in the tone of a man saying things he had been preparing to say. Caleb sat with Nathan through the night. Eliza sat on the other side of the bed and did not leave. Sometime before midnight, Nathan turned his head toward Eliza, and his voice, reduced by fever to something thin and careful, said the things that fathers say when they have accepted that the time for saying them is shorter than they had hoped. "You gave me everything worth having," he told her. "You and your mother both. You made me a father when I thought that was behind me. You made me understand what it meant to love something more than yourself." He stopped, started again. "I need you to keep going, Eliza. Not for me, because that kind of obligation isn't fair to put on you, but because there is so much ahead of you that you cannot see from here, and I have seen enough of you to know that you are equal to every piece of it. Don't go," she said. Her voice was the voice of a child, not the composed, forward-facing voice he had spent weeks traveling beside. Just a child's voice asking for the thing that children ask for and that the world cannot always provide. "I don't have a choice in this particular matter," Nathan said gently. "But you have choices, more than you know, and someone to help you make them." His eyes found Caleb across the bed. "Take care of her." "I will." Caleb's voice was steady. He made it so. "On everything I have. She needs the kind of steady that I couldn't always be, the kind that doesn't disappear. I'll be the kind that doesn't disappear." Nathan looked at him for a moment longer. Something in his face released some final held tension, letting go. "Good," he said. "That's good." He looked back at Eliza. He raised one hand slowly and touched her face once with the back of his fingers. Then his hand came to rest on the blanket. A little while after that, in the quiet of a room in a small town in Montana Territory, on a night when the first real snow of winter had begun falling outside the window and laying itself in clean white layers over everything that had been broken and difficult and wrong, Nathan Croft stopped breathing. Eliza's cry in that moment was not composed or controlled or forward-facing. It was the sound of a child, and it was the most honest sound Caleb had heard in a very long time. And he held her through it without speaking, without trying to manage it into something smaller, because some things deserved to be as large as they were. 6 months later, when the snow had gone and the ground had accepted the spring, in the way that ground always eventually accepted whatever the season brought, Caleb Harrow stood in a small cemetery on the hill above Millstone Creek. Two graves side by side with new headstones that had been commissioned with the specific intention of permanence. Grace Harrow, beloved wife, teacher, keeper of truth. Clara Croft, loving mother, sister, witness. Warren Hale had arranged for both women to be reinterred here side by side from the separate and insufficient places where they had previously been buried. It had been, he said, the specific thing he could do. Not reparation, not absolution, not any of the larger categories of making right that were not available to him. Just this. The two sisters finally in the same place under stones that said their names clearly and without apology. A third stone stood nearby. Nathan Croft, protector, father, good man. Eliza placed flowers on all three graves. She had picked them herself that morning from the meadow behind the small house they had been living in since March, a modest place on a generous piece of land near the northern edge of Millstone Creek that Caleb had purchased with the money he had been not quite spending for 3 years of traveling. She moved from stone to stone with a quietness that was not sadness exactly, or not only sadness, but the quality of someone in the presence of people they have loved and lost and have not finished loving. She placed the last flowers on her mother's grave and stood there for a long moment with her hand resting on the stone the way he had watched her stand at the oak tree in the forest on the night they had walked north together. "Do you think they found each other?" she said, "on the other side?" Caleb stood beside her. The spring air moved through the cemetery carrying the smell of new grass and something sweet he couldn't name. "Yes," he said. "I think they found each other immediately. I think that was the first thing." "Grace was looking for her," Eliza said, "her whole life. And now she's not looking anymore." "No," Caleb said, "not anymore." Eliza slipped her hand into his. Small, warm, entirely real. He closed his hand around it and held it the way he would hold it for the rest of his life, with the care that is reserved for things whose value is fully understood. He stood in that cemetery and took account of what 3 years and one dark night in April and an 8-mile walk through a frozen forest had built out of the wreckage they had started from. A promise made to a dead woman kept through the living daughter of her lost sister. A badge broken in half laid on a grave, neither piece retrieved. A ring on a cord still worn because some losses do not require setting down in order to continue forward. They only require being carried differently. He had come to Millstone Creek looking for a name. He had found the name and the name was finished. What he had not expected, what he had not known to look for was everything else. The fortified cabin in the northern forest. The girl with the wounded feet and the two old eyes who had read him more accurately at first meeting than most people managed in a year. The man on the bed who had loved a frightened woman enough to give up everything for her and had been paying the price of that love ever since with a consistency that Caleb found on reflection to be among the more admirable things he had ever witnessed. The locket, the photographs, the two faces that were one face. The understanding that the 3 years of riding had not been moving him away from something lost. They had been moving him through routes he could never have predicted or chosen towards something he did not yet know he needed to find. "Can we go home?" Eliza said. The word arrived in him the way it had arrived in him the first time she had used it 3 weeks after the clearing, when she had come in from outside and said casually and entirely seriously that she thought home needed more firewood. It landed with a weight that was disproportionate to its size. 4 letters, 1 syllable. The most precise word available for a specific kind of belonging that had to be made rather than found. "Yes," he said, "let's go home." They walked out of the cemetery together through the gate and down the hill toward the house where the fire was banked and the spring morning was getting on with its business of being ordinary and good. He would teach her to ride properly this summer, which she had been asking about since February. She would teach him apparently to be less suspicious of people at first meeting a project she had undertaken with a patience and persistence that he found both entirely characteristic and intermittently exasperating. There were things ahead that he could not see clearly yet. There were difficulties that came with any life built honestly in the world, and he had no reason to believe this life would be exempt. There were nights that would be hard and mornings that would require more effort than they should. There was grief that was not finished, because grief of a certain depth was not the kind of thing that finished, only the kind of thing that changed shape as time went on and made more room for what was also true. What was also true was this. The girl walking beside him was Grace's blood and Clara's daughter and Nathan's legacy and her own complete and formidable self, and she had chosen from the first moment she had run out of the darkness beside the river on a cold November evening to keep going, to face forward, to ask for what was needed from the one person still standing who looked like they might be able to provide it. She had been right about him. He had not known that yet when she had made her assessment. He was still in the process of learning it. The wind moved through the spring grass of the Montana hillside and carried the warmth of an approaching season, and the two of them walked together toward whatever was next, carrying the ones they had loved, in the ways that the living carry the dead, not as weight, but as direction, not as loss, but as the thing that tells you which way to face. The last witness walked forward into the light, and the man who had learned to live again walked beside her.